Today, many different church hierarchies exist, and they all claim to be instituted by Scripture or the apostles, yet they cannot all be right. Due to the disagreements today and how a church should be run, I think it wise to look at the earliest church and see how it developed under the leadership of the apostles. Therefore, this video will be on the development of church hierarchy in the first 80 years or so as directed by the apostles. In the beginning, there was just the apostles and the congregation. We see that in the first few chapters of Acts. So we see in Acts 2:42, and they devoted themselves, that being the congregation, to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayers. The first office to be set up was that of deacons. We see this in Acts 6 with Stephen, Philip, and several others. The word for deacon in Greek, diakonos, simply means servant. Now, as the gospel spread, it became necessary that a leadership office, as opposed to a servitude office, take charge at churches because the apostles couldn't be everywhere at once. The first time we see the word elder is in Acts 14:23. For context, Paul went from Antioch to Cyprus, then to Antioch in Pisidia, then to Iconium, then Lystra, where he was stoned, and then Derbe. Finally, he went back to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. And when he did, quote, they had appointed elders for them in every church. With prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Now, this only happened once the gospel went out into the Roman Empire, as I said, because the apostles couldn't be everywhere at once, so they needed to set up some kind of overseeing office. Now, elders are mentioned again in the next chapter, and it's in Jerusalem. Now, I found this one interesting because the apostles were in Jerusalem, including James, which we see in that chapter. There's two, or really three reasons it could be, or maybe all three of them, that could account for this. First, perhaps because many apostles had left, and leaving just James and maybe a few others, but most have probably left, or may have left. It could also be because many of them went on missionary trips, and they needed someone to stay and oversee the church in Jerusalem. And lastly, it could be because they were modeling after the churches that were set up to show that it is a legit way of setting things up, basically. The next time the elders are mentioned is in chapter 20 of Acts. In chapter 19, he goes to Ephesus, he being Paul, and in 20, he calls together the elders to come to him, and he speaks to them. Lastly, for Acts, in chapter 21, the elders are once again mentioned in Jerusalem. Elders are also mentioned in Philippians 1, where Paul sends his greeting to everyone with the episkopois and the diakonois. Now, the episkopos came to be known as bishop, but here is probably just referring to overseers or elders. We see this also in the pastoral epistles, where presbyteros and episkopos is used interchangeably. Speaking of the pastorals, we also see presbyteros mentioned there. So we see, now let's just assume that they were written by Paul in the early to mid-60s AD. In Titus, the word for elder, presbyteros, is used interchangeably with overseer, that being episkopos. Furthermore, the qualifications are similar in 1 Timothy 3 for an overseer as they are in Titus 1, using the same language of above reproach. Furthermore, the only instructions that are there are for overseers and deacons in 1 Timothy, suggesting that those are the only two offices, suggesting that the only two offices at the time were elder and deacon. Therefore, we still see in the New Testament talking about elders and deacons. Speaking of the pastoral epistles again, there's Titus and Timothy, which I would say were probably proto-bishops. Now, in the letters to both, they are charged with setting up overseers and deacons, so they can't be overseers and deacons, and they are in charge of the church and keeping everyone in check. In Titus, the same is true. Plus, he explicitly says in chapter 1, verse 5, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." In the letters to Timothy, he gives directions on who can and cannot be overseers, which suggests he is also ordaining them there. Now notice that Titus is over a town, that being a larger area, which bishops usually were. They weren't just for one church. So, it is also found that they are in charge of the money, what is taught, and to teach. We're going to come back to this in a little bit, but I would suggest that these were at least proto-bishops. The next time we find elders or bishops, or episkopos I should say, is in 1 Clement, which I would date to the late 60s. So, we see in two areas that diakonos and episkopos is being used interchangeably or mentioned, those are only two mentioned. So for the first quote, you'll see that he only mentions episkopos and diakonos, just like Paul did in Philippians 1. This suggests that he's referring to the same thing by episkopos as Philippians and the pastoral epistles, that being overseer or elder. Now you look at the second quote, if you read that, you'll notice, like scholars have noticed, that the term presbyteros and episkopos are being used interchangeably. This suggests that they are the same office, and therefore probably elders, not actual bishops quite yet, which is one of the evidences that 1 Clement is actually quite early. Around the same time of 1 Clement is the Didache. This twofold structure, as even acknowledged by Holmes, whose source you'll see in the back of this, or at the end of this video, resonates with a closer date to the 60s than it does Ignatius, which would be about the early 2nd century. Next is Revelation. Now this book was written at the very end of the 1st century, about 95 to 100 AD. And we see that he talks about angels of the 7 churches. However, the fact that some of these angels were allowing evil things would suggest that they weren't literal angels, or else they wouldn't be allowing evil things, but rather the heads of churches or bishops. And since there's only one, that would suggest it's a bishop and not elders, because there's usually multiple elders. Finally, we get to Ignatius of Antioch. He says something like this in all of his, or many of his letters, but here we're in a quote from the Magnesians. Be eager to do everything in godly harmony, the bishop presiding in the place of God, and the presbyters in the place of the council of the apostles, and the deacons, who are especially dear to me, since they have been entrusted with the ministry of Jesus Christ. Here we finally see the threefold division clearly laid out. Now let's go back to our important question. Did the episcopate come about under the guidance of the apostles? First thing to note is that Polycarp is said to have been made bishop by John the Apostle in Asia Minor, which must have happened before 100 AD when John died, and also John was an apostle. This is said by Tertullian, who mentions John specifically, and Irenaeus mentions that he was made a bishop by apostles, just generally. He doesn't name John, but he does say that it was apostles in Asia Minor. Hegesippus reports that John set up bishops in nations surrounding Ephesus. Eusebius, possibly also using Hegesippus, records that a bishop was set up in Jerusalem after the death of James and after the destruction of Jerusalem by apostles and disciples of the apostles. Now, this would have been in the 60s and 70s, because James died in the early 60s, and the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed at 70 AD. So this would have been 60s to 70s. It must also be kept in mind that Clement is said to have been ordained, that's Clement of Rome, by Peter, by Tertullian, and who is using records from the Roman Church, suggesting that the mid-60s was when the bishopric was starting up. And lastly, there's Timothy and Titus, who were probably bishops. Now, the first thing to note here, or the most important thing to note, would be that the earliest all these are happening, like with Jerusalem, Clement, and Timothy and Titus, that this was all in the 60s. So that's probably when it started up. The scholars who say bishops started early, many times point to John as very important in this respect. However, I would say that Peter, Paul, and the Jerusalem disciples also had a hand in it, though John certainly increased it, at least in Asia Minor. Therefore, the timeline of the hierarchical development of the church is as follows. Early to mid-30s AD, the office of deacon was established. 48 to 50 AD, during Paul's first missionary journey, the office of elder was established. Lastly, in the 60s AD, the office of bishop was established. Therefore, it would seem to me that the Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Anglicans, and even some Lutherans have it right, at least in terms of the minimum ecclesial hierarchy of deacon, elder, and then bishops. Though most of them go farther and have archbishops and cardinals, but that's a different conversation. They do have at least the minimum that I would say was established under the apostles.